Nice to get an opportunity to present on my work. I spent the summer in Afghanistan this past summer, interviewing educators, teachers who spent 30, 40 years of their life teaching in time of conflict. In this presentation, I will talk about, I'll focus on 3 points. I will talk about how I got introduced to oral history and why I chose oral history as my method. And the second point is why I think oral history is important and it can play a significant role in preserving the histories of societies that are trying to emerge out of conflict. And I will focus on the example of Afghanistan to try to explain that significance that I see in oral history. And lastly, I'll show a few clips of my interviews that I did over summer, and we will have a discussion about some specific elements and some observations that I have about the clips about memory and how certain narratives are constructed in the memory, and how these individuals that I've picked these clips purposefully because they really tell about how they construct these memories. So why did I choose oral history as my method? It's interesting because usually when people decide to do research, they decide on a field or a subject, and then they choose a method, and then they go reach out to subjects. For me, it was completely the other way around. I knew my subjects way before I knew about oral history. I'll explain how this happened. I came to the U.S. 7 years ago as a freshman in high school, on a scholarship with the help of an organization called Seeds of Peace, and I left the school that I left behind in Afghanistan was in absolutely horrible shape. It was notorious for the amount of violence that happened at the school, for the number of times a week people got stabbed, or the number of times that teachers were wrestled down by students in the classroom, or physically too. The school was in absolutely awful shape. There were no windows, no furniture, and it was the school that I went to is in the middle of a bazaar, and it didn't have any walls that enclosed it from its surroundings. And what would happen in the afternoons would be that shopkeepers from the local bazaar would make their way to the school after they've had a nice lunch, and they'll find a corner on campus, just take their afternoon dump. It was just absolutely open. The campus was absolutely open with no sense of a school campus, because it didn't have any walls. It wasn't closed off. So this is the school that I left behind in 2003 when I came to the U.S. And I mean, if I give you the image without telling you that it was a school, you would think it's an abandoned building. It's some sort of ruins. The only thing that marks it as a school is because some transmission of knowledge happened during the day, because about 30 to 40% of teachers on a lucky day would show up. So this is 2003. I come to the U.S. in 2003 and I start school here. But I go back every year to Afghanistan in subsequent years, and every time that I went back to Afghanistan, I was incredibly surprised and impressed by the amount of progress that was made at the school. Between 2003 and 2005, 2006, the school completely transformed from the ruins that it was into a very vibrant, very beautiful, very green, campus where there was discipline, there was order, there was actually learning and teaching happening. And I got involved in this school too. I did some community service projects, and I got a chance to closely observe what was happening at this school. And I was curious to see why the progress, or how the progress was so rapid. I mean, there was progress happening in general in the country because there was a lot of money flowing in, and there's a lot of international attention since 2001. But the pace at which the progress was happening at the school was, incredible to me. So I looked closer, and what I found was that most of the progress that had happened was because of the innovative leadership style that the principal of the school had. It was pretty much everything that had happened was due to his style of leadership and how he could use the resources that he had, which weren't much at all, to rebuild a school. We will see a clip of the principal talking about his experience in a few minutes, but this guy was absolutely incredible. This is a school of 10,000 students. 10,000 students, a public school. It has only a couple buildings, and it runs in 4 shifts a day. It starts at 6:30. Say first shift goes from 6:30 to 10. Then the second shift of students come in from 10 to 2, and then 4 shifts a day. And the last shift ends at 7:30 in the evening. This principal would come in 6:30 in the morning and be at school till 7:30. Around 10,000 students who were notorious for being rogues and violent. But the school was absolutely known for how violent it was in Kabul. But this guy changed the school within 2 or 3 years into one of the top institutions in Kabul, both in the sense that it graduated really smart students and well-trained students, but also because it had a very conducive environment for learning. So I took a closer look at him and I observed how he went about his leadership, and to show you the innovative style of his leadership, I would share an example of something that he did that I think I've shared with you. This guy put together a disciplinary system that was absolutely fascinating to me. In the traditional way, a student would be disciplined by getting beaten in the palms of their hands with a stick, or even in the soles of their feet if they did something wrong, or if you were lucky, you could get away with just getting a quick slap in your face, because you get a sensation when you get slapped, but it doesn't last that long. But if you get beaten with a stick, it lasts longer than the pain that you feel from a slap. So this is the traditional method of how discipline and punishment happen in schools. But this guy changed that. What he did was he put a penal system, like a fine system, in place, where if a student did something wrong, say if a student had 5 absences in a month, he wouldn't get beaten 5 times in the palm of his hand, but he would be fined to bring 5 bushes and plant them in the school. Or he would be fined to pump 5 hours of water and water this rejuvenated garden of his school. Or he would have to shovel the dirt for 5 hours, because, as I told you, the school was completely it was in ruins. There was nothing growing there before, so the soil needed preparation for things to grow again. So the student would be the punishment would be to have the student out there in the sun shoveling the dirt for 5 hours, or the worst. There was a hierarchy of punishment, and the worst was the traditional way of fertilizing the land still is human manure. So the worst was that the student would get to bring some manure to a campus to fertilize the gardens. So it's very innovative in a sense that
I should think of some of these things.
In a sense that he solved multiple problems with this style of punishment and discipline. In the short term, he took care of the greenery in the garden, because he didn't have any resources to hire gardeners or the people to do the work. So your only resource is the student body. You use it, and it was a long-term solution too. If you put the student to work into creating the garden, it's more likely that he won't destroy it. He'll protect it. So it's, for me, little things like this that he did were absolutely fascinating. So having observed these things, I came back to Colombia with a mission that I wanted to bring this guy to the U.S., say for a month-long tour, to give him a chance to see high schools as well as colleges, because he's never been abroad. But if you see how innovative he gets and how he manipulates the little resource that he has, I thought a trip abroad for him would do 2 good. First, that he would get to see, other systems of education and how people go about teaching and organizing and leading schools. And secondly, because I thought he had an incredible story to share and to people here, to share with people here, that how do people go about managing or leading a school in such difficult times? They have to get creative. So this was my mission. I came back to Colombia. I was trying to get this guy over here. I worked on it over a year. It just financially just wasn't possible. I spoke to people, applied for grants and everything, but it didn't work out. I needed about $5,000 for it. I didn't give up on spreading word about him, but I had to, give up the idea of bringing him here. So I wrote about him to, certain papers and stuff like that. It was about that time that I was trying to look into other ways of spreading the word about him, that I attended a lecture by Mary Marshall about oral history. You give a presentation at CUSP. And as she talked about, the power of the method and how it and I realized how it could be an immediate solution to what I was trying to do, to spread his story, to get his story out, but also a long-term solution to make sure that his story is recorded and his story remains to people who are interested in the education and the history of education, but just to people down the line who will be curious about how these guys went about leading the schools under such difficult circumstances. So when I listened to a lecture by Mary Marshall, I realized that oral history could be useful to me as a method. And when I say that my subjects found my research method, this is what I mean, that I had my subjects in mind first before I decided on oral history. So far I've talked about oral history in the sense that it helped fulfill my immediate need of getting this story out. But what does this have to do with the notion of archive and when I say that oral history is important to post-conflict societies? How are those things related? About the same time that I decided on oral history as my method, I came across a article on BBC about. And the article confirmed some fears and doubts that I had about history in Afghanistan. First of all, the article was about history textbooks in the Afghan curriculum, like the current textbooks that are used to teach students history in Afghanistan. The first thing the article focused on was pretty fascinating to me. It showed how biased the language is, and how there is a lot of political propaganda and political purpose behind the way the books are written. As an example, to show you what I mean by this, the article gave a quote from one of the history textbooks in Afghanistan on the issue of Kashmir. This is international history to us. So the history of Kashmir, the idiom, the language it's described in is this. It says, the land-grabbing and greedy Prime Minister of India would not give up Kashmir to our Muslim and brother friends, Pakistan, who are the rightful owners of the land. And I can testify to this language because I use a similar textbook. This is the language that, a history textbook is written in, that our students get trained with. This was the first thing that the BBC article focused on. The second and the more important point was that it had a quote from the Minister of Education on the writing of local history. The Minister of Education said that it would take Afghanistan another 30 to 40 years at least before a factual history of the violence that happened the past 40 years could be written. This is the official stand. The Minister of Education saying that it will take at least 3 to 4 decades before the time is right for factual history to be written. And why is that? I wanna explain this point a little, and it will show the importance of what I mean. Why I think oral history can play a significant role in conflict areas. So, why can't the history of the past 30, 40 years of Afghanistan not be written right away? Well, it's a history of absolute devastation and brutality of civil war. 30 years, at least 20 years of that was just brutality, just bloodshed, people dying. In those 20 years, 6 million people left the country. This is a quarter of the population. 6 million people. It's a number that even the tragedies of Rwanda and Darfur can't match. And all this happened because there was a power vacuum left. When the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan and the communist regime fell, there was a power vacuum left. And political parties started fighting over power. A civil war broke out, and in this civil war, the civil war lasted for about 10 to 15 years. Thousands and thousands of people died, and 6 million people left the country. So, if this is the history of the past 30 years of Afghanistan, a history of suffering because of civil war, now the history can't be written because those elements who caused the suffering are still prominent in the society. The people who caused the bloodshed, the people who took away a lot of lives, are still very prominent in the society. When a society comes out of conflict, it doesn't. When there's relative peace, it doesn't mean all is well. It doesn't mean there's freedom to write whatever you want, however you want, because those elements who cause the suffering will be around until they fade out. So a factual history of Afghanistan cannot be written for this reason, that these people who fought over power, who caused all the suffering, are still pretty much controlling the country in one way or another, directly or indirectly. They will not let anyone who spends the idea of a factual history get to their goal. They will get in the way. So this is one of the reasons why I think oral history is important. And I'll get to that. And also, if you have such turbulence of 30 years, where 6 million people just leave the country, and I can give you an image of what Kabul looked like during these 10 years. People just left behind furnished houses because all they could do was, protect their family and leave the country with their family. They didn't care about their belongings. Kabul was like a ghost town, just painted with blood all over for about 6 or 7 years. If you've got such turbulence where the only thing people care about is their lives and trying to save their loved ones, you can't hope for much of an archive to remain and to be preserved and protected. So for 30 years, all people cared about was their lives, about trying to get their family food, trying to get peace, try to find a safe shelter. You can't expect an archive. Either the archives, the government archives that we had, got caught in the crossfire and got burned that way, or got systematically destroyed by political parties who saw the archive as against what they were trying to do. So if you're coming out of such a history of 30 years where the archive pretty much doesn't exist, but the history cannot be written for another 30 years because the elements who caused the suffering of the lives and also the archive are still prominent in the society. If you come out of such a situation, the risk you run is losing a lot of stories, losing a lot of historical knowledge until the time is right for it to be written down. So now there's relative peace, but the history cannot be written for another 30 years. This transitional period, the generation who suffered during the Civil War, they will die. They will pass their time, but their history cannot be written for another 30 years. So it's a huge risk of losing all those stories. And if the history of 30 years is pretty much the history of the suffering of a people, we need to make sure that those stories are archived and recorded for when the time is right for it to be incorporated into history. That's where I think oral history can play an absolutely crucial role. That it's a method that could meet our immediate needs of preserving these stories, and preserving these stories in a way that the power of oral history for me is the fact that the individual who's telling the story has complete control over it. You know, if somebody else, if you think of the conventional sense of history, it's the author who spins the evidence any way he or she wants. But in oral history, it's the individual telling the story has complete control over it. The closest thing that the role of the interviewee comes to is the role of a collaborator, you know, of generating questions to make sure you get a complete story, to try to get as much detail as possible. So if not only is oral history helpful in the sense that we'll be recording these stories and preserving historical information, but we'll also be honoring the suffering of the people in the past 30 years by giving them the agency over their history. You know, by giving them the opportunity to tell the story, to tell their history in their own voice, rather than having someone else write about them. Especially if it's going to be written about 30 years later, there's going to be very little accuracy to it if the information is not preserved. So that's why I think oral history can play a very significant role in such societies like Afghanistan that's emerging out of conflict. And with that realization in mind, I went home this summer to try to carry a little oral history project of my own, by going back to the same school that I went to before coming here, and by interviewing and recording the stories of the people who not only taught under incredibly difficult circumstances, which you know I was a witness to. Most of the teachers I came here when I was in 9th grade. Before that, the teachers would come to school, but there would be 2 or 3 months in a row that they wouldn't get salaries, but they would still come to school, and they would still, you know, attend classes and try to teach. When you've got bombs and rockets flying over, when pretty much 90% of teachers had side jobs of selling potatoes on the street, or driving a taxi around in their spare time, because the money they were making was either not being paid to them, or what they were making was not sufficient to keep their families going. So I went back to the same school, and I selected three teachers and the principal that I wanted to sit down and interview and record their stories. Now the challenge of interviewing teachers is twofold. One, I got trained over the summer. I attended the summer institute with Mujib Mashal and Ron, where there's a lot of preparation work that goes in before sitting down for the interview. You look up background information on the individual. You read articles written about them. You try to learn as much as possible before you sit down, so you have good questions. You have good knowledge of the person, so you could generate as much detail as possible. But it's difficult with the teachers because there's nothing written about them. How are we going to do that background research if they're just ordinary citizens teachers? That was my first challenge, and so I basically spent the first month just having a cup of tea with them and just having a casual conversation to try to get some background detail, nothing official, but some background detail, and a sense of their life before I could sit down with them and ask them specific questions. So that was the first challenge. The second challenge is that the teachers are not used to talking about themselves. If you sit down with a politician or a leader, they could go on for 5 hours talking about themselves. They've done that all their lives. But if you sit down with a teacher, they don't really have much to say. They don't think of their stories as significant, especially in a country like Afghanistan, where ordinary citizen has very little power, very little influence on what happens in the country. So this was my second challenge. How am I going to get these teachers to talk, to share their stories? And it was quite a difficult challenge. That now that I listened to my first hours of interviews, it's like I would throw a question, I would get like a 2-word answer, there would be a silence, then I'd have to ask another question. And for 2 of the interviews, this is what happened. That I had a difficult time the first hour trying to get the person to talk about himself. I would pause the interview, and all over again, I'll give him the same explanation that I tried before the interview, that there are people who are really interested in your story. That not only they want to learn about how you lived your life, how you adapted to these difficult conditions. Not only they want to learn about it now, but this is an opportunity for you, for your story to be included in the future history that's going to be written. So I would give him this speech again that I had prepared as part of my preparatory month that I spent researching, and then I would restart the interview and start asking questions again, and as they got more comfortable and as they got talking, the answers would get longer and longer and much more detailed, much more interesting. So this was with 2 of the teachers that I had this problem. The other 2 teachers, one of them was a teacher, one of them was a principal. The teacher was a history teacher, and I had taken a class with him when I was a student at the school, and I really liked his method of teaching, because what he would do is he would teach us history as if it was a story, in very, very simple language. He would just sit at the edge of the table, he would roll up his sleeves, and he would just start talking as if it was an anecdote, it was a story, and he would catch our attention that way. Most of the people didn't have textbooks to read about it, and there were no libraries to do research on people. So the classroom, that 1 hour that you had with the teacher per week, was pretty much your only chance to learn history. And if you don't have a good teacher who can capture your attention, then that opportunity is lost as well. He was amazing at what he did. He would just sit at the edge of a table, he would lecture for like 30 minutes, he would tell us a story, and then you'll have 2 students stand up and repeat the story. That's what you call a story. He would have 2 people repeat the story. The next day that he would come in, he would ask 2 or 3 people to see if we remembered the previous day's lesson. And his style of punishment was really interesting too. That he would have 3 people stand in front of the classroom. Usually 1 or 2 people could manage an answer and get away with it, and he would have that person who managed the answer punish the other 2. And it was an interesting style of punishment. He would have the student who had answered pull 2 or 3 strings of hair from the temple area of the students who couldn't answer, so the rest of the students were just sitting there and watching this happen. And a lot of our classmates had beards, and they were like older students because there was a discrepancy in their education system, because they couldn't go to school 5 or 6 years. So you see this 20-year-old guy standing in front of the classroom who couldn't answer the question, and then you have somebody like me, 13, 12 years old, tiny, trying to pull a couple strings of hair and try to punish this guy, and you see tears flowing in the eyes of this 20-year-old with a beard. And everybody in the classroom is just watching. Maybe that's not the part of his teaching method that I want to focus in, but the way he told, the way he captured attention was fascinating, and his style of dressing was really interesting for me too. That in 2002, when schools restarted, teachers were required to wear a Western dress, like a suit or a shirt with jeans or dress pants. But this guy, you will see a picture of him. He has a huge beard. He's like 60, 65, and he was used to wearing a turban and the traditional clothes. So when he was required to wear this Western suit, for the first couple of weeks he resisted it. He would just come in his turban and his traditional clothes, and he would just lecture. He didn't really care about anyone at all. And then, the administrators got more rigid and asked him to start wearing, your suit. So he pulled some old suit that he had from 30 years back, And what he would do is he would wear the suit on top of his traditional clothes. Because what we get the traditional clothes, you have long shirts, right? So he would not feel the need to take off his shirt and wear, like these short dress shirts. What he'd do is he would tuck in his long shirt into his Western pants. Then he would wear, the jacket on top of it, and he would not take his turban off. So you got this guy wearing a Western suit with a traditional turban and a huge beard. But that didn't take away at all from from how we learned from him and his style of teaching. So he was one of the people that I pointed out that I wanted to go to and ask his story, because I knew he had gone through a lot. He was 65 years old, and I wanted to get his story. And he will be the first clip that we will see. The second person was the principal. I got really close to him because I went back and I did a couple of community service projects, and I really, I can't say I used the fact that I got so close to him, but it built a comfort between us that I didn't have with the other three teachers. That I had to establish that comfort with the other three, whereas I had it with the principal. And I guess being a principal is kind of a political role as well. So he was used to talking about himself, and I had a much easier time having him speak. I think I interviewed him for 5 to 6 hours, and during those 6 hours, I don't think I asked more than 12 or 13 questions. Whereas for the other teachers, for a 2-hour interview, I probably asked like 40, 50 questions. It just shows, how comfortable certain people are. And comfortable in the sense of their natural skills, but also because of the role that they have in society and how that role shapes how comfortable they are in talking about themselves. I'll play the first clip. The first clip is the history teacher. He's talking about 1972.
Turn off the lights.
1972, where 1972 is when pretty much communism establishes in Afghanistan and the communists, start their government. And he's talking about that period, that transitional period where the republic falls and we have a communist government taking over. So we'll see what he has to say about that transitional period, and then we'll just have a brief discussion about things he says.
انقلاب شد. من در لیسه گلبار بودم. از لیسه گلبار من تبدیل کردم در نورالدین گلبار آمدم. دیگه در این وقت یک تعداد احزاب ها به نام خلقی و پرچمی و حرکتی و شعله‌ای و تو بعضی احزاب ها تو به نام میشنیدیم طرف در گشت و گذار. بعضی ها نامد صحبت میکرد با ما معلوم بدیم. ما علاقمندی نداشتم که در جریان‌های سیاسی خودم دخیل بسازم. حتی بعضی دوستایی که هم سنفی میبود میامد شب‌ها میششتیم، بعضی جا رو بحثا میکرد. باز از من دعوت میکرد میفتم، ما والا همی سیاست ها خوشم نمیده. باز داخل وقت برام میگفت برو که سیاست خوشم نمیده. یک برات میگویم هر کسی دیگه هم که پیشت همه نگو که کیت نیستم. بگو دوست هستم کیت هستم مگم رسمی ما شامل سازمانت شدن میتونم. مشکل دیخوانی دارم یا مشکل فامیلی دارم، دیخوان هستم، از بالای مزرعه کار میکنم. کسی را جواب منفی ندی که باز به حیاتت خاتمه داده میشه. دوستای بسیار خاصم بازی دا بسیار عمله میکرد. و دیگه که حکومت زمان ترکی چند وقتش که گذشت، هر روزی که از خواب میخیستیم تا صبح 6 بجه که چای بخوریم و به طرف مکتب بریم، تا مکتب در سایه کاپیسا پروان سراغ ترور 5 6 10 تا معلمه میشوندیم. فلان جای معلمه دادن، فلان جای معلمه دادن، فلان جای معلمه دادن. و یکی از روزهایی که بسیار برای ما خسته کنیم. کسی قدیر نام داشت، قدیر خان بشیر مرزی خان عبدالله و این یک وقت که تیلی در کابل رفتیم، این برای خانومش در اون وقت مدره 17-18 سال رو تکریم مفتمو بچه ماش 12 سال و 17 سال به خانوم تکه میدیم گفت دوستش دارم میگرم میگم این گپ بین ما چند سال پیش گذشته بود که این روان هستیم در باسکیل 3 باسکیل هستیم در یک قسمت به نام زمین تل میگن زمین جهویشا بورال مردمان سر بازار خریدن اینی میگه در باسکیل روان هستیم که 2 نفر پیشوری ما استاد شد در مومن سنت در زیر خیلی پیش کفار کشیدن استاد شدیم اروا گشتیم که گاله توکل ما را میکشن دیگه سعی کردم که هدف یا سر از این قدیر است و میلی سالار وقتی که سر علی رو دادن این در عقب ما پد شد ما قرق ما میخواد مرمی کردشون گفت و 10 تام تیر میشه 1 تام تیر میشه خبر که باشه تیر میشه بالاخره نفرها قسمی سعی کردم حرکت میکنن که مرمی به جان ما اصابت نکنن بالاخره یک گر یا کرد سید کلشینکوف سعی کردم که یه هفتی دمش در بغل بوت آمد یک کمک لبایش لرزید یک قفل دمش آمد محمود در حالی که خودم روح در قالبم نیست یک نظرم دوستین پشت پای خود به دهن نایدون متوجه شدیم که دیگه یک نفر دیگه هم از پشت یک درخت خیزه 3 نفر هم توی زمین هم جندرها رفتن ما ایران موندیم بالاخره بگی آمد مرده زیر بالا کدیم دیگه نفرهای باید که بکی در فامیل ازی خبر دادن مرده ازی آمد دیگه سعی کردم که خانمش در حالی که سرش و پایش بچست میرسید و یک خون متاسب این قسمت پیشانیش تازنقش آمده یک خط خون مرده که تا کردن همی خانی میدی که زبانش همی خون نداشت که زبانش خونش آوارش نداشت و صحنه بسیار دلخراشی برکن و او وقت ما متوجه شدیم که مدره 17-18 سال که به این تکه گرفتن و راسی قابل ازی بوده که ارزشی داشته که تکه روایش گرفتم که خون مرده شوهر خدا با زبان خود آب کرد.
There are a few things about this specific anecdote. The question that I translated at the beginning was pretty much the question I asked him. I didn't tell him what way to tell me a story or to give me any information about Qadir. I didn't know that he was going to tell me about Qadir. But it's amazing how he structured the story for us. That he started with a very, general image of what was happening in the society right at the transition from the Republic to a revolutionary communist period. And then he got specific to individual. And then he went back a few years to tell us a story about how they had come to Kabul to buy fabric and they had shared a little joke. And he did all this without me really asking anything. The only question that I had was a very general question of, just tell me about what things were like when the revolution happened. Where were you? And it's amazing how he made these connections. For one reason, because he's used to telling stories, of sitting at the edge of the table and just used to making connections between historical events and saying it in a way that makes sense to us as a listener. That skill is very, apparent here. But the detail that he gives is absolutely incredible too. The gesture of his hand when he talks about the husband, the wife licking the blood. Just few words and that one gesture is incredible. It raises a question about video that we talked about in the Summer Institute, that oral history has traditionally been done audio and just transcript. But here we see the power of that the image could have as well. That it's true that if it's a good quality audio, the grain of the voice comes through, and you kind of get a sense of the emotion, but you don't get that gesture. You don't get the emotions on the individual's face, and it's, to me, all those things put together with the way that he structures his memory is absolutely incredible. I thought I would open it up if anyone has any comments about this clip before I move on to show you the second and last clip. So if anyone has any specific comments.
I thought his eyes were so sad, and so.
This is the principal. He's talking about the year 1992 and early 90s when. So the previous clip was about the transition from republic to the communist regime, and about 20 years have passed between the time that the guy he's talking about. This is early 90s. The communist regime has just fallen. The Soviets have withdrawn from Afghanistan. This is when the civil war happens. There's a huge vacuum of power. Those people who kicked out the communists start an infighting, fighting each other over power. And as I said earlier, Kabul absolutely turns into a ghost town and a just bloody city. So he's talking about how that period affected the school and what was going on in the school.
مکتب تو شد که مهاجرین سمت غرب به این مکتب سرازیر شد، به مکتب های دیگه آمد. به این مکتب مهاجرین بود در سه منزل از این مکتب شد. بالاخره بودن مهاجرین در مکتب و این کشمکش های داخلی که تو شد به داخل شهر کابل، خلاصه در مکتب یک فضای بسیار نادرست و ناگواری که اصلا یک جزوه تربیتی حالا که دپار به یادم میایه و فکر میکنم راستی حالت بسیار بد و ناگوار بود. یادم به این مانو که در جزوه تعلیم تربیتی که سنفا شاگردها درس میخوان در اتاقش پرده ها زده شد و اتاق حتی با دو قسمت سه قسمت تقسیم بود. در قسمتش یک فامیل از مهاجرین بود، دولت بسیار رقتباری ها زندگی میکرد. حتی چوب سوخت اگر یا داشتن یا مثلا تیل و نمک و هرچی که بود اونجا اتاق بود. دو اتاق ها بود که تندور آورده نشد، تندور های سه رقم تو روز تیر میکنن به چهار مردم بوده و اتاق ها شد با آتش میکنن. دیگه دود بود، دیگه گرد بود، خواب بود، هر گپی که تو شایسته به یک دیگه تعلیمی تربیتی نبود. بنا به مشکلاتی یاد داشتن. حتی در داخل صنفا چوب پیدا میکنن، حتی در داخل صنفا سنگای کلام بود که تبر یا پا نداشتن وسایلی که چوب پیدا کنن یا چوب پیدا میکنن. صنفا زمانی که مهاجرین دیگه باشه دیگه مکتب تا کجا شاگرد بخوان در کل اتاقها مهاجرین بوده. گفتم که در هر اتاق دو فامیل سه فامیل مهاجرین بود. خب ما بیاد داریم که یکی از مادرها بود، این مادر پیچه سفید پوسه فامیلشان که آمد این مکتب. مادر داغریده بود، از ما برخوردش معلوم میشد. هر روزی که ما میامدیم و میدیدیم که حتی دروازه مکتب شکست و ریخت میشد، کلکینای صنفا شکست و ریخت میشد. دی گفت واقعا ما متأثر شده خون میشدیم و بالاخره بنا با وظیفه که ما داشتیم مدور ما مکتب بودیم. بازمه که این مادر تفاهم داریم که توی روز اول ما یک دعوا داشتیم که مطلب مال مشترک همه ما باید به خاطر حفاظت نگهداری از ما توجه بکنیم دیگه. اینجوری نمیشه که هر روز ما بریم که سن پلیدگی باشه و هر روز ما بریم دروازه پلیدگی باشه و بالاخره خولات شما باز دوباره به مطلب پیدا و بعد نزد به شهری احساساتی میشد حتی رهبرهای جهادی را که گلبودین و قرآن‌دین و امثالش باشه این دو میزد نجیب دو میزد سر و صدای دینی در آمد و بالاخره باز راستی بنا به مشکلاتی که ما در این مکتب تحمل کردیم این مکتب جور شد ما جگر برای مادر خوب کرد و بالاخره ما کتزیم گپایی که اگر تمتر آمد و زشتر آمد بیره گفتیم که مکتب خب مال ما مزید والا ما اجازه تو نیزینی که اینجا میپرونیم ما هم در یق داریم سر صبح بیتباره باید نکنی اگر میکنی باز ما یه گفتم یعنی تا یه اندازه گفتم که مادر زنا خب قابل قدر و قابل دیست که ما باید احترام و حرمت در خصوص بچه که بیچه سفید هستی بزرگسال هستی ما کوشش میکنیم که همون برخورد باشه که یا با نفس شوه نگاه شوه و اگر با تو میگوی که دستبردار نمیشه کردیم دروازه در فکر نیستی که به زنا که از بغل نمیتم.
Clearly, wrestling people down is a theme that keeps coming up. Not only did the students wrestle teachers down, principals, the administrators were using it as a method too. I think Nemat probably recognizes the dialect that he speaks in, and he's not talking. He has a very colloquial, very street slang that he's talking about, that he's talking in. And that's really that really represents his style of leadership and management too. That he doesn't go to management books, or he just tries to shape his style to the needs of the students and the kind of students that he's leading. And this is an interesting story for me too, because for a couple of years I went to the same school where half of the school was literally divided just the way he's talking about. That families were living in the classrooms. I said the classrooms didn't have windows and doors. They had cloths and curtains covering and to try to keep away the cold in the winter. And they actually had ovens, and they had heaters, like wood heaters and wood stoves inside the classrooms. That's how they warmed up. Basically, the school was turned into like a refugee camp. And he does an amazing job just describing. He goes on and lists all these things. Like you feel like he's about to stop, and then another thing comes to him, and he goes, "Oh, when they brought in huge rocks to chop wood," and then he stops, and then "Oh, they started fires in the classrooms." Clearly, he has a lot in his heart that he wants to just unload and share with people. This is pretty much what I had. The two clips that I showed. I haven't really gotten to edit the other interviews that I've done yet. This is pretty much. It's a little difficult doing the subtitles and translating the way they speak to try to keep the nature of how they're saying it, the originality of it, but also make it so it makes sense in English. Elizabeth was helping me a lot try to capture that, because sometimes I would literally translate word to word, and then it wouldn't make sense in English. But I still really wanted to keep that original nature of it, because the way they speak, the way they share their stories is as important as the stories themselves. So if you guys have any comments,
Thank you very much.